So, are you trying to figure out how to calculate margin on a product or service that you offer? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Hey, bad ass business owner. Now, one of the things that you love to do is to learn more about your numbers. So you want to understand margin and gross margin a little bit better. Well, we're going to talk about margin, but first you got to understand the difference because you're going to hear both of these terms, margin and gross margin. First off, margin is typically associated with a product or a service. Margin is the difference between a product or a service's selling price, so what you sell that product or service for, and the cost of goods to produce it, so the parts and the labor to put it together. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But for most products, it's just going to be the parts to that product in most cases. Now, gross margin, on the other hand, is the company's, it's looking at the bigger picture. So it's more of like the company's net sales and revenue. So you add up all those products and services minus its cost of goods sold. So gross margin is typically associated when you're doing it on a bigger scale with the whole business, where margin is typically used when talking about an individual product or service. So once again, either way, it looks just like this. It's sales minus cost of goods sold equals margin or gross margin, whichever one you're trying to go for. So the key to gross or to margin is just understanding it's sales minus cost of goods. Now let's take a look at a couple of different examples and how you want to understand how this works. So let's take a product. So in this case, product, we're going to say it's this board that this guy's holding. It sells for $5. The cost of goods, so when the person who sells it goes out and gets it and buys all the parts to it, it costs them $3. So margin, when we're using that term, is $2. It's going to be the difference, right? Sales minus cost of goods equals the margin. In this particular case, the margin on this product is $2. Now, let's say you have a service-based business. Let's say you're a plumber and you have a service that you sell for $80. Well, your cost of goods run about $35. Now, this is where it gets a little bit different because you have $15 in parts, but you also have the $20 in labor to pay for the person going out for the hour to do the service. Because your cost of goods, if you've watched any of our other videos or any of the other trainings, you'll know that on cost of goods, when it comes to a service, you have this additional cost of goods, which is the labor, because this service cannot be provided without attaching somebody to it. So I'm not saying that you're charging someone $50-$60 an hour, but the reality is, what are you paying the fair wage to the person doing it? Now, I know yours might be more than $20, but in our particular example, it's a $20 labor hour because that's what they're having to either, paying themselves a fair wage or someone that they've hired $20 to do it. So their cost of goods are $35, in which case our margin in this example is $45. So sales minus cost of goods leads to that margin. Now, gross margin for the business is going to look like this. You have sales of $5,500. Their cost of goods, when they add it all up for their particular business, whether it's just the products, the materials, or if they are service-based, it might have that other piece, in which case their gross margin for this particular business is $3,500. Now, I want to look at this a couple different ways before you go, because why is knowing your margin important? Well, margin is actually the potential profits prior to your expenses. And this is where a lot of people get hung up, is they just look at margin and get all excited about the potential profits they have to make. But the problem is you do have your expenses, and by knowing and understanding your margin and your expenses, it actually will help you become more profitable, because this is where people get into trouble. Let's take a look at our 3 examples. Let's go backwards this time. We're going to start with the business. The gross margin, if you recall from our last example, was $3,500. Well, at the end of the month, their expenses tend to run $2,000, in which case they know that their profits are going to be $1,500. So they're able to understand based off of that what they're going to do. Now, when you're looking at a product, you don't necessarily have expenses per product, but you do understand from your profit and loss statement. Once again, we have other videos to help you understand how to read your profit and loss statement. So please make sure that you watch those. There'll be a link in the show notes, as well as probably one popping up here on the screen. But your margin, let's go back to our folks here. We know that it was 45, right? Well, when it comes to expenses, this is why knowing your P&L, let me bring that back in, is you will have a percentage of what your P&L, what your expenses run on your profit and loss. So in this particular plumber's business, their expenses tend to run 30%. So because they know 30% is their expense numbers, they know they need to set aside from this particular sale 30% of their sales of the sale to go towards expenses. So since it was an $80 sale, if you recall, times the 30% they know they're going to need for expenses, they know that an additional $24 out of this is going to have to go towards the expenses. So knowing the margin is $45 and knowing what their expenses are, they know that the profit from this one particular $80 sale is actually going to be $21. Hopefully you can follow along. Now let's take a look at the product, the same person, because this is where it's going to start getting interesting. So hang with me here. Remember the margin was $2. This particular business runs a little bit higher in expenses because they have a brick and mortar. So it's 35%. So out of that $5 sale, once again, we figure out what the expenses are going to be needed. 35%, guess what? That's $1.75. Well, you can tell that that's going to make a huge dent into what the profit is of this particular product, because you're going to see that that $2 margin went down to only 25 cents for the profitability. That's crazy, because when you think about it, if they even sold 400 of those puppies at a quarter, they're only making $100. So they definitely would have a pricing problem, if you will, or a cost of goods problem. They got to get either the cost of goods down, expenses down, or get that price raised up, because 400 of those suckers and only making $100 at the end of the day, that hurts. Okay. No matter what, that hurts. Now, I want to go back because sometimes hiccups happen, right? So let's go back to our plumber for a minute. You might recall really quickly, their margin was 45 after their expenses. They had a profit of 21. But what if for some reason they got stuck on the job and the job took an extra hour? Well, let's see what happens. Remember, they had a profit of $21. You might recall that their hour to be on the job was an additional $20 for the labor hour. Well, guess what? Because they got stuck at that job, they actually only made $1 because they still have to pay the person who was there for the extra hour, and they just didn't have that wiggle room in there from the profit. And you can see here that just being stuck on the job cost them profits. And that's one of the things that cost people all kinds of profits, because they don't understand that your margin has to be good enough to be able to absorb if something happens along the way. And in this particular case, it just wasn't. Now, gross margin, sometimes you will see as a percentage, not just as a dollar. So sometimes you'll see it as just margin or gross margin, and it's represented as a dollar number. And sometimes you'll hear gross margin percentage or whatnot. All gross margin percentages is the gross margin dollars that we've been talking about divided by the total sales. So if you take the gross margin divided by the sales. So let's look at our 3 examples. Remember our product, we made a gross margin of $2, but we sold it for $5. It meant that their gross margin percentage was 40%. So the dollars were $2, but the percentage was 40%. Our service person had $45 in gross margin divided by the total sales meant that their gross margin percentage was 56%. And when we looked at the entire business, the business's gross margin was $3,500 divided by the $5,500 in sales meant their gross margin percentage was 64%. So this way you can kind of see it as both dollars and percentage. And hopefully you've been able to see and understand a little bit better why it's important that you know this number. It's one of the most important numbers that you can know in your business. It does take a calculator in figuring it out. And for some people, you really need to understand every single product or service that you sell, what that number is. Now, I want to make it easy on you. I've created a spreadsheet that you can download. It'll be in the links below. And you'll see here that in my example, this is an actual snapshot of the spreadsheet. And you'll see that you just have to calculate in the numbers. You'll put in what the product or service is. You'll put in the price that you sell it. You'll write in what any raw materials that you have for it. You'll put in if you have a franchise, that's in there to cover for some of you guys that have a franchise fee that has to go out. And then labor costs. Labor costs are typically on only, if you've watched the other videos, labor only goes in there if your labor is needed to provide the service. For most products, the labor is people ringing it up and stuff like that. That goes under payroll. That doesn't go under cost of goods. Cost of goods is when you have to have a person involved in that product or service. And then you'll notice on the far right-hand side, you'll see where it tells you what your gross margin dollars are, as well as that percentage that we just talked about. So it's a great little handy tool for you if you are interested. See the show notes. Now I'm going to give you some homework. It's your turn. I want you to grab that gross margin sheet or create your own, and I want you to go out there and I want you to discover the margin on your products and services. And if you're ready to learn more about your business numbers, then head on over to our course, Know Your Business Numbers. Have the power to blow up your profits and sales. It's over at knowyourbusinessnumberscourse.com. We take a deeper dive not only on your P&L, we talk about your gross margin, we talk about the reports that you need to know and understand, a whole bunch of good, juicy stuff, a deeper dive into it. And if you liked this video and what you saw, don't forget to give us a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, click that bell, make sure you never miss any of the episodes that come out. Remember, we try to keep them short and sweet so you get a nugget to go. And if you love listening and learning on the run, don't forget to download the Badass Business Owner podcast onto your phone using your favorite podcast app. We also are located, all the shows are here on YouTube as well. Now get out there and be the badass that I know you are.